They've been knowing you for years.
That's
How you
awesome.
dedicated.
All right, so we're live.
Do what?
Do they
Yay!
retire?
I don't know. Do they retire?
Do
Brother Lawrence?
pastors retire?
Sort of.
Kinda. They hide. They hide for a long time.
Brother Carl, he still does. He fills in and
Yeah.
We just had a pastor pass away that we began with. It's a great Bible study from Jerry Fortson. He got COVID and his wife. They went in the hospital. He died of pneumonia.
Oh, wow.
It's heartbreaking because, that's where our salvation began. He got saved. And she was a friend and a pastor too. It's sad.
Yeah, that is.
Okay, well, we're in chapter 9 and 10 of Ezra, which gets us through this weird period in Israel's history where everything kind of seems to be out of step and they don't really know what to do yet. And that is definitely true through the first 7.5 chapters of Ezra. And then Ezra actually comes on the scene. And up until that point, it is the kings, the Babylonian kings that have kind of dictated that things are allowed to happen. And then there's opposition that is keeping those things from happening. All centered upon the temple being rebuilt. All for the purpose politically for Babylon to establish a new outpost to the south that will thwart the continued uprising from Egypt. So they have a political reason for doing it. But they're behaving and playing right into what God had already promised his people, that they would return after 70 years, and that they would again have. God never promises a temple; He just promises their return to the land that He had given them. So the temple becomes the focus, and for good reason. The only time that they were truly unified as a people was when, after Solomon had built the temple and all the nation was worshiping there. So they recognized that. What caused the problem was at the time that Solomon died, if you recall, there was a rift that occurred. Rehoboam, who became king, Solomon's son, he took some bad advice. And that advice was to become heavy-handed against his own people. And what resulted in that was a rebellion in the north that caused the northern tribes, 10 tribes, to break away from the southern tribe. That breakaway became identified in two ways. One was the worship of idols. In fact, Jeroboam, who was the leader of the rebels, he set up 2 golden calves, one in the north or the southeast, one in the northwest. And he said, these are the gods that brought you out of your slavery in Egypt. And so they began to worship these idols because they were cut off from the temple. Out of that became some synchronistic worship of other idols that existed still in the land because they had not cleansed all of the land like God had told them to do. And then they began to intermarry more. When monotheistic worship collapsed, everything began to collapse. Okay? And so it just continued on that way until God finally really fulfilled what he prophesied to his people when Moses, you're going to do these things and I'm going to send you out of the land. Okay, and so that's where they've been for 70 years. Now, after that time, here they are allowed to come back. And the thing that they go to do is to build the temple. Well, they kind of cleaned the foundation and they set up an altar so that they can worship, offer sacrificial worship, and that's about all that they've accomplished. Okay, and that's where we are. So in the midst of that was the first wave that returned to the land. The second wave came with Ezra, who was introduced at the end of last week's study. Ezra comes and he is not only a scribe, he knows the law inside out and backwards. He knows everything about it. He's devoted his whole life to the law. He's also from a priestly line. So he carries some authority, but Ezra is the kind of guy that would rather lead by example rather than by any power that he may be perceived to have. He never claimed any power for himself as he leads these people. He only offers illustration and example. So his life becomes, the exemplary nature of his life becomes his leadership. When we get to Nehemiah, which is coming up, Nehemiah is much more forceful as a leader. More what we would think about as a leader. Now, why do I bring that up? Because when Ezra comes on the scene, you immediately get this shift in the literature, the way it's written, that the kings were making the decisions and the opposition was shaping what was happening. But when Ezra shows up as one who knows the law and as one that is a priest, everything becomes focused on God again. And so the actions that are taken from this point forward are a reflection of what they understand God wants them to do. And the two broad areas that they're operating in here is that we want to be a holy people, like God had intended for us to be from the very beginning, and we want to be a people that worship. Okay? So when we think about God's grand scheme of things, we're looking at the same kind of life. We want to be a holy people, set apart for God, okay? And the ultimate end to our life is worship. That's Paul, on several occasions, describes for the Christian on how their life becomes a continuing act of worship. And he describes it in prayer and constantly being together, sharing songs, hymn and spiritual songs to lift each other up. All these things communicate to us that our life before God is just one continuous act of worship. So in that we discover that we worship well or we worship poorly. That's really the only options we have in life. Same thing is happening here. They know the mistakes that they made before, okay, and they don't want to repeat them again. So that's what Ezra is about. So the last part of chapter 8 says, the exiles who had returned from the captivity offered burnt offerings to the God of Israel, 12 bulls for all Israel, 96 rams, 77 lambs, along with 12 male goats as a sin offering. So we talked about the 12. The 77 and the 96 have ancillary meaning, but nothing that we need to bog ourselves down with. It says, all of this was a burnt offering for the Lord. They also delivered the king's edicts to the royal satraps and governors of the region west of the Euphrates, so that they would support the people and the house of God. So, when Ezra left, the king of Babylon had made clear that you were going to have everything you need, and he issued an edict to all the governors that were on the other side of the Euphrates, okay, which is a very large area that the king of Babylon controlled. They that was the governors that were to commit themselves to this project as well. All right, so chapter 9. So after all this had been done, okay, it took them about 4.5 months to get there, and they've been there about 4 months, okay? So after all of this was done, the leaders approached me. This is Ezra speaking in the first person, and in this little bitty section he does. It says, approached me and said, the people of Israel, okay, the priest, the Levites, have not separated themselves from the surrounding people whose detestable practices are like those of the Canaanite, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Ammonites, Moabites, Egyptians, and Amorites. I like reading that list because I can pronounce every one of those words. Because usually I can't pronounce any of them that they throw out there. Okay, so they come, and he says, the people that have just come here with us have already begun to intermarry with the people that were here before. Now, where did these people come from? To repeat again, after Nebuchadnezzar moved the people of Judah, and previous to that, the Assyrians had moved the northern kingdom, moved those people into exile, they moved other people in to occupy the land. So they just moved people around like a chessboard to get them in different places. That was their way to control the behavior of the people. So when the exiles show up from Babylon, they get there, and there's these people, and they immediately begin to marry. Now, the speculation, it's not stated here, but obviously there wasn't enough women that had come back.
Were they or weren't they pagan nations? Pagan.
Well, they are described as being pagan because of their detestable practices.
Right.
And we may assume that, although we've already discovered that some of those folks had begun to worship Yahweh and had learned that from the people that had been left behind during the exile. But here we had the problem again, probably, of synchronism. And what I mean by that is worshiping a lot of different gods. That's what they do in India. You can worship as many gods as you want in India because it can only bring something good for you. So it's a very egocentric type of faith system that goes on there. Whereas our worship, our understanding of God, a monotheistic type of belief, is that the God is the center of that and there can only be one. Mm-hmm. So this was what was going on there. We don't know what the detestable practices are. We don't really get a description again of Asherah poles and all these various things that were stood up to allow for pagan worship. But the people that have returned are describing these people that were in the land in this way. Okay, so ding, the bells go off. This is the same problem we had way back when Jeroboam separated the kingdom. That's one of the first things they would have thought of. We're about to repeat the same problem again. All right? So that's the word. Oh no, we've got to do something about this. So he says, indeed, the Israelite men have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and their sons, so that the holy seed, which is the proper translation of that, has become mixed with the surrounding peoples. Okay, so they use that as a very real thing. The nation was wedded to God. That's the way that they viewed their tribe, their nation, their ethnicity of people as being wed to God. And so now that union was becoming polluted. And there was no way that would stand. Okay, not based on racial lines at all. Racism was not the problem. It was paganism. It was a religious bigotry, so to speak, and rightfully so, because you can only serve God. All right, so this is what they were fearing, is that these people have moved back. They've been in exile for 70 years because of this, and the first thing they do when they move back is start intermarrying again. And that really has them worried. Okay? So, the leaders and officials have taken the lead in this unfaithfulness. What are they saying? That the first people to start doing this were the Levites and the priests and the leaders. Okay? So, of course, if they're doing it, pretty soon it's going to spread like wildfire. Yeah. There's no way they're going to shut this thing down.
Is that like women had no choice?
Women were more like property than they were anything. Yeah. Well, but it would have been, there would have been a lot of motivation for the women that were ancestors of those that had been transplanted in, because what's about to happen is there's going to be a reclamation of family land. It's already begun, and it's going to become more. I'm fixing to take care of you, darling.
Look, it's just me. I've been running like crazy.
Well, it was warm in here earlier, and I was just listening to the baseball game before I came in here, and it's 39 degrees in Ruston.
Ooh.
So is it supposed to get cold? Is
Well,
it kind of moving?
tomorrow, but not. It's not going to be really.
Moving slow? That's
It's
good.
not going to be really
Actually,
cold.
I saw a little of the news as I was getting ready, and they said that that front was going to be
A few
moving
days
up,
later, this
and
going
it
to
was
be
going
another
to
one.
stay warm.
Oh, well, that's fine with me. I got stuff to do. I don't need the cold weather anymore.
No, it won't be cold. It won't be really cold tomorrow.
That's pretty good.
Okay, so the leaders are having their problem, okay, because there's two things about being on God's land. There's two promises that God made. Your genealogy is going to be countless, okay? That's what He promised them. Your descendants are going to be like the stars in the sky and the sand on the sea, all right? And then I'm giving you this land. Well, see, now we're back in the land, and these people have to have what's next? They got to have a genealogy. But there's no Hebrew women. So they're taking the people of the land. And that's how they're described there's the people of the land, and then there are the exiles that return. So they're trying to solve a problem and at the same time creating a problem. And so Ezra's response is, when I heard this report, I tore my tunic and robe. Okay, and I pulled out some of the hair from my head and beard and sat down devastated. This is the only time that word's ever used in the Old Testament.
Really?
Yeah. So this is
It's appalled.
yeah.
Mine says Astonied.
Astounded.
Astounded.
No, there's no you.
Anyway, he's undone. It's almost like Isaiah when he's in the temple and he's in the presence of God and he says, I am undone. There's no way. Okay, so this is the worst thing to Ezra to find out, because it's going to undo everything that God has intended to do. If they knew about their past with Rehoboam and Jeroboam, he certainly knew what Moses had promised them they would do, that they would defile the land. So he knows something has to be done. And from our point of view, and even from theirs, it becomes pretty drastic. Okay. One of the reasons why it appears drastic is because the timeline is very tight. Like 8 or 9 months, this whole thing that we're talking about happens. But there's children already involved. So either the timeline's wrong, or they're dealing with people who are already there that had come previously with Zerubbabel, and they had intermarried, and no one had said anything or done anything about it. That's more likely what has happened. So the problems has really been announced to Ezra, and he has already proven himself to be an exemplary leader. And so the mistakes that have been allowed to reestablish themselves, he's got to undo. Okay? Go ahead,
No.
please.
Come on, Pastor, talk.
Why would he feel like he had to undo them though?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I don't understand that. Why would he feel like he would have to undo them whenever?
Yeah. I think what he's going back to is Leviticus,
Well, I know.
and
Yeah.
and being very legalistic about it. We also have to understand
That would be wrong to be legalistic.
that would be wrong.
Yeah.
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 There's that's what I mean.
They saw wishy-washy.
There's
This, that, another.
no matter what happens in this, there's going to be a negative that occurs, and not just negative to our sensibilities, but negative to even what God wants. So they want to establish holiness, but they're going about it the wrong way. But they're going about it the only way that they know. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Because it's not until Malachi prophesies to this group and says that God hates divorce. And yet, these are the people that have backed 100 men or 111 men into this activity of divorce. So they're trying to fix a problem, but it creates a problem. And this tends to be the way things happen when we go off and do things without clear direction from God.
Amen.
And he was in a place to tell these people. So he of all people should
Yeah.
have consulted, and I mean even.
Yeah, well, one of the commentators I read today is that Ezra was more devoted to the law
That's right.
than he was to his
people.
seeking out God and what God would want for his people. So now we see this becomes a very fine line to have to try to walk. We think that is all just black and white.
Well, my thing is, why did he feel like he had to fix it?
Well, I think he felt like he had to fix it because they were fearful that it was going to result in the same thing that had happened in the northern kingdom during the divided kingdom. I think they felt like that there was going to be undue influence from pagans that they were marrying that was going to upset the apple cart again. Okay.
Not even believing they could be changed.
Well, that's part of the you know.
Maybe God's going to change them along
While
the
they
way.
were in exile, Isaiah teaches them that what God is about is you're going to be witnesses to who I am to all the nations.
That's right.
Okay, and so they returned without that portion of God's revelation.
Mm-hmm.
Not that they were ignoring it; it's just that it was superseded by this rather reactive response.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Okay.
what it was. Reactive.
Yeah,
Reactive,
yeah.
Okay.
Now, when we get to the end of Ezra, we find that there's no word that says they did anything about this. It just says that they identified that these 111 men had married, and then it ends. The whole book ends.
But he sends them off though, right?
Well, and when we get to Nehemiah, we find that they've been sent off, but that kind of juggles the timeline too. At what point did
He sent them off.
this happen? Yeah,
Break up those families.
yeah.
All first.
Yeah, and so and see, there's a juxtaposition to this particular thing that we have to look at, and that is the whole story of Abraham and who?
Isaac. Oh, you're talking about Abraham. I'm sorry.
The handmaid.
Hagar.
Yeah, the handmaid. Oh, what's her name?
Abraham and Hagar.
Hagar.
Okay, so what happens in that story?
Yep.
Okay, for no fault of her own, she winds up having a child with Abraham because she is told to have a child with Abraham, right?
Right.
Okay, and not too long after that, the human attitudes come into that, and they begin to give each other a hard time. Yeah, yep. One child cheating, another child bad, another wife cheating, another wife bad. So what happens? Sarah goes to Abraham and says she got to
Her
go.
and the kid got to go.
Yeah,
That's a shame.
And it's
All right.
your fault.
yeah, yeah. So
You allowed this to happen by listening to me.
Where did Abraham get this thought
okay,
to
but
have to do that?
well,
That you would do.
in a very real sense, that was a divorce.
Yeah.
It accomplishes the same thing that a divorce does, right? You have destroyed a union
Uh-huh.
that was not necessarily God ordained, but we find out later that God certainly is not dishonoring the ones who were involved in that. So Hagar's out; she's about to die, and she's given up hope. She's trying to provide one last little thing so her son Ishmael won't die. And who shows up? God shows up, and God says, I'm going to make your son a
Yeah.
great nation too.
Wow.
And she later declares this most beautiful statement that, my God is the God who sees me.
Mm-hmm.
That is true.
Beautiful statement.
Yeah.
Wow.
So when we look at God's mercy in that,
We wonder how Ezra ever got it wrong.
well, because he wasn't looking that far back, was he? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Everybody got it together back then.
So
Yeah, but he was.
Patsy's she has a lot of trouble. She got a lot of trouble with Ezra.
I said he was the
Presidents we
leader.
have now.
He was an example.
They don't make
Well,
people.
you gotta.
We'll never have
too,
grandkids named Ezra. I can promise.
His fear was probably that God would leave the people, would abandon them like He had in the past, and they would be desolate again. They would end up enslaved or
So the point, the contrasting points excuse me, I know English better than that. Works this way. We can be legalist and depend entirely on that. Okay? Or we can know what God has said in His law and temper it with His will. Okay? The whole counsel of the Bible provides us, I think, a perfect picture of the will of God. But when you pull parts of it out from the other, you lose that.
That's right.
And this is an example of that. Okay? Now, as God does, He takes our mistakes and works something good from it. If He didn't do that, we'd all be doomed. He wouldn't have much to work with. So this is kind of where we're at in this. But you still can't take away as much as it is. We still can't take away from Ezra's sincerity. This was a sincere moment that he was living with his people. And so that becomes important to us too. Meaning what? We can't really judge people.
Right. Exactly.
When we find them in these moments. We can't really judge them. Because most people are just doing the best they can with what they have. Now, they may not have as much as you, but nobody poured it in your lap and you just accepted it either.
That's right.
People have to discover these things in the way that it will work, in the way God is unfolding. And we have to give room for that. If we don't, then we wind up, mirroring the same behaviors that we're not real happy about. So he says, he prays his prayer. My God, I'm ashamed and embarrassed to lift my face toward you, my God, because our iniquities are higher than our heads and our guilt is as high as the heavens. So he is recognizing that there's sin here and guilt to be dealt with. He says it's been terrible from the days of our ancestors until right now. Our iniquities have been, we have been handed over along with our kings and priests to surrounding kings, to the sword, captivity, plundering, open shame, as it is today. So what he's saying is everything that we've done as a people has just brought nothing but trouble upon us. Okay. Now what he's talking about is from the First Temple period on. Okay. But everything that had happened during it even began to fall apart during Solomon's day. He said all of that sinfulness has brought this upon us. But now for a brief moment, grace has come from the Lord our God to preserve a remnant for us and give us a stake in this holy place. Now, there's two things, all right? To preserve a remnant means that he has provided his people a way of escape. I never understood what that word remnant meant. I knew what it meant theologically, that there was this fragment of people that God was going to use to raise up. But when the word actually means has given them a way to escape, that adds more to it. For me, it did anyway. He has preserved a people for this and has given us a stake. And that word literally is a tent peg. It really is a stake. And what it meant was he's given us a chance again. We've been able to escape from this bondage of exile, and he has again allowed us to put our tent pegs in the ground in this holy place. So he's allowed us back home. Even in our slavery, God has given us a little relief and light to our eyes. Okay? So what he's talking about, the light to our eyes, literally means he's given our brightness back. There's brightness in our eyes. Though we are slaves, our God has not abandoned us to our slavery. He has extended grace to us in the presence of the Persian kings, giving us relief so that we can rebuild the house of our God and repair its ruins, to give us a wall in Judah and Jerusalem. All right, so let's look at that for a little bit. So he's allowed the brightness to come back to our eyes, and verse 9 is what ties us so directly to his thinking about the law. The law was given when? To God's people. When they were wandering in the desert, escaping their slavery. God gave them the law so that they would know how to be holy before him. Now he's equating their exile period as being slavery. So the way out of that slavery is to again observe the law that God had given them. So this just further deepens his commitment to purifying the race again, okay? He says, we didn't advance us to that. He extended his grace to us. And recalling that this is before the kings, what he's speaking of is to the most powerful people on earth. He's allowed his grace to operate on our behalf and giving us relief again so we can rebuild the house of God and repair its ruins. And then this idea of a wall, it's not the wall we'll read about in Jeremiah so much as being a symbolic wall, because it's saying a wall in Judah and Jerusalem. The only wall that's given attention is the one in Jerusalem. So he's describing that he's given a maybe another way to describe it is a hedge of protection for us to do this. Okay. Although they meet resistance, we find that again when Nehemiah gets on the scene. God is there with them and protecting them. That's the point. So he says, now, our God, what can we say in light of this? For we have abandoned the commands you gave through your servants the prophets, saying, the land you are entering to possess is an impure land. The surrounding people has filled it from end to end with their uncleanness, by their impurity and detestable practices. I want to see if they give. So there is the passage from Deuteronomy 12 that describes the land of Canaan before they go in. Okay, that's where part of this is coming from. So do not give your daughters. This is God speaking to them. So do not give your daughters to their sons in marriage, or take their daughters for your sons. Never pursue their welfare or prosperity. Which, okay, that's more direction from Deuteronomy. Okay, chapter 7, which Ezra and Nehemiah both build upon. And then he says, never pursue their welfare and prosperity. Okay, that's from Deuteronomy 7 as well, except we find that later God does instruct his people to have mercy on those who are in the land. So there's, again, this is that whole proof texting problem that we sometimes fall into. There's one place where God says, get rid of these people, and there's a place where God says, have mercy on these people. And so we have to look at the whole context of where these things are spoken and then how they come together under the will of God. Okay? So this, he quotes this, he says, so that you will be strong, eat the good things of the land, and leave an inheritance to your sons forever. Okay? So that's another reference to a post-exilic direction from God. You can't leave land to the sons of Hebrews if they're not purely Hebrew. So that's still the thinking. Okay? After all that has happened to us because of our evil deeds and terrible guilt, though you, our God, have punished again, though you, our God, have punished us less than our iniquities deserve, meaning that your punishment has not risen to our offense, and have allowed us to survive, should we break your commands again and intermarry with the peoples who commit these detestable practices? So again, we discover he's got one thing on his mind, and that is God's direction when they entered into the land of Canaan the first time. here they are entering the land of Canaan again for the second time after their exile. So all of this adds up perfectly in everyone's mind. Okay? Wouldn't you become so angry with us that you would destroy us, leaving neither remnant nor survivor? So this is a rhetorical question. If we do this, you're going to become angry and you're going to destroy us. Lord God of Israel, you are righteous, for we survive as a remnant today. Here we are before you with our guilt, though no one can stand in your presence because of this. So, they don't want God's nose to flare. That's what they're talking about here. It's the same word that would be used to describe a bull when its nostrils are blowing. Okay? So we don't want you to become angry that way. And we know that you're righteous, and the only way that we will survive is to again fulfill your law. This is the reasoning. All right. Harsh. To break up families, but that's what's going on here. While Ezra prayed and confessed, this is chapter 10, weeping and falling face down before the house of God, an extremely large assembly of Israelite men, women, and children gathered around him. This is the language doesn't capture what is happening here, but he is just repeatedly getting up and falling. He's getting up and falling. So remember, I said he doesn't call people to the temple. It's just by his actions people come. He's not a very vocal leader. He wouldn't be one to say, "You come here. I've got something to tell you." But in his actions of remorse and guilt, the people are drawn to him, and not just the men, women, and children. And then the people wept bitterly. They joined with him in that. Then Shechaniah, son of Jehiel, an Elamite, responded to Ezra, "We've been unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women from the surrounding peoples, or the people of the land. But there is still hope for Israel in spite of this. Therefore, let us make a covenant before God. Let us cut a covenant," is the literal meaning there. So what happened when you made a covenant was an animal was split open in two, and the two halves were separated, usually on two pillars of stone. Okay, and the people that were making the covenant, the agreement with one another, would pass between those pieces of animal. And the idea is, if I break my side of the covenant, may my fate be the same as this animal. May I die because I break his covenant. Okay? It's the same kind of covenant that God made with Abraham, only God passed through, not Abraham. Because there was no way that Abraham was ever going to uphold the covenant. God is the covenant in every sense. So they're making a covenant before God to send away all the foreign wives and their children, according to the counsel of my Lord, that my Lord being Ezra, and of those who tremble at the command of our God. So we know that you are following God, and we're also going to follow those who tremble at the command of God, being the law. Let it be done according to the law. That's what I just said, huh? Get up, for this matter is your responsibility, and we support you. Be strong and take action. Right out of Joshua going into the promised land. Be strong and take courage. You're going in. So the parallels are just, they're remarkable all the way through it. And the people are recognizing that Ezra has a proper understanding of what needs to be done. Okay? So here we go. Then Ezra got up and made the leading priests, Levites, and all Israel take an oath to do what had been said. So they took the oath. This is relative language to the covenant that they were speaking of earlier. Ezra then went to the house of God and walked to the chamber of Jehohanan, Jehohanan, I can't say it, son of Elishab, where he spent the night. He did not eat food or drink water because he was mourning over the unfaithfulness of the exiles. So they come up with this plan, okay, that they're going to take an oath to sever their relationships with their pagan wives. He go and he fasts for the night, and he mourned all night because of their unfaithfulness. They circulated a proclamation throughout Judah and Jerusalem that all the exiles should gather at Jerusalem. Whoever did not come within 3 days would forfeit his possessions according to the decision of the leaders and elders, and would be excluded from the assembly of the exiles. So that sounds, wow, that's a long way to come in 3 days. But by this time, the area around Jerusalem, if you recall, had laid desolate. And so a lot of the land that was farther out, when you get into the Levant area, the Kidron Valley, some other places, very fertile. So the people that had moved in had settled in those areas, which would have been much farther than 3 days for the Judeans to come. So they had to settle in closer. And so it was possible for them to do that. So they said, if you don't make it, you're excluded, and you'll be excluded from your people, basically. So all the men of Judah and Benjamin gathered in Jerusalem within 3 days. On the 20th day of the 9th month, okay, all the people sat in the square at the house of God, trembling because of this matter and because of the heavy rain. Okay, so it's the winter months. If you recall, the first month of the year is really the beginning of spring. And this is near the end of the year, 4 months. This would be the 8th month. And this is the rainy season. And it's mentioned here that it's a heavy rain. It's an unusual rain. And they've all been gathered. So it kind of adds to the gloom, I mean, really, of what's going on. So their hearts are heavy because they're living under this guilt of sin, and then the rain is heavy. Then the priest Israel stood up and said to them, You've been unfaithful by marrying foreign women, adding to Israel's guilt. Therefore, wait, this is interesting. Okay, this is an interesting thing. Okay, they've been back and they've been offering animal sacrifices now for a while, even the ones that have returned with Ezra,
Still carrying the guilt.
and they're still carrying the guilt.
Yeah. I thought that was weird.
Yeah. See how you can never escape the guilt.
Yep.
You can worship exactly like it's designed for you to worship, and when you walk away, you're still guilty. Man, this calls such great attention to Christ Jesus, where he says to us, you accept the sacrifice that I make, and there is no guilt. You will never be guilty. There's no condemnation at all in this. Even though I die as a criminal, there is no condemnation. But these people are busy in their worship, and they still feel guilty. Yeah.
Well, they're made to be guilty.
Yeah.
Ezra.
Ezra's trying to set them free, baby.
It's all about
Wait, Matt, what you said?
His prayer was basically condemning everyone.
She says that they feel that Ezra's making them feel condemned,
Oh,
guilty.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Ezra tonight.
and it's one of those little places, one little line in the Old Testament that just highlights the fact that no matter what happens, they had this understanding that it was just kept adding to their guilt.
Yep.
Okay, they're going to find out that ridding themselves of foreign wives is not going to take away any more of their guilt. This is not what God wants. It just
That's why it's so frustrating.
yeah.
So
Because
ridding
it's a matter of the
themselves
heart,
is
not
not
matter.
ridding themselves of their wives. Can you repeat that last statement? I'm sorry.
Ridding themselves of their wives is not going to eliminate any of their guilt. It just becomes an
There was
exercise.
guilt before the wives.
Yeah, yeah.
There was guilt before, during, and after.
And Ezra makes it clear that by doing
Feel more
this, you're
guilty.
free.
Yeah.
You're not free.
So the only hope, yeah, the only hope that this could ever, the only possibility that this could ever bring about for them is some sense of purity. Well, if you're going to look in history, you find out right away. All you got to do is to go to their greatest king and find out that there's no purity to be had at any level here. All that you're left to do is to come to God guilty, offer a sacrifice that either says, Lord, I'm acknowledging my sin and I'm asking you to deal with my sin, or I'm acknowledging that I need you in my life as a fellowship offering. Please be a part of my life. Those were the two basic sacrifices in a nutshell. And when they came, the priest said, your sin is forgiven. No, he said your sins. They couldn't forgive sin. And they knew it.
Yeah.
They knew it because the minute that you walked away from there, you were going to sin. So they knew it, and they knew it. Okay? But it's almost like the thinking is this is the best we can do. That's not even that's going on. There's just some level of we've got to keep the law. So it becomes what the New Testament would describe the Pharisees as being. That if you just follow the law, that's all you need is to follow the law. They had separated themselves almost, well, really completely from God because they didn't recognize him when he was standing right in front of them. See, this is the same kind of behavior. Not to put down Ezra, he's doing the best he can, as we said before. He's working with what he's got, okay? But it does stand in juxtaposition to even what the Old Testament teaches. So they all gathered in the 9th month, and the people sat in the square, trembling because of the rain. Then the priest Ezra stood up and said to them, you have been unfaithful by marrying foreign women, adding to Israel's guilt. Therefore make a confession to the Lord. Let's see, that's the right word. Let's see, make a confession to the Lord, the God of your ancestors, and do his will. Separate yourselves from the surrounding people and your foreign wives. Okay, so basically, I'm looking for, I got to find a word here for a minute. Where's the therefore? Confession, the word that is used there for confession almost always means thanksgiving. And so it's an interesting play on the idea of confessing. He's actually, it could also be made to say, you should give thanks to the Lord your God so that you are able to do his will. That would be the other translation that would be possible there. And some translations have that. And then he goes on to say, separate yourselves from the surrounding people and your foreign wives. Now, part of we all know the Samaritan problem in the New Testament, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so they were looked down upon. Why were Samaritans looked down upon? They were half brothers to the Jews, because the people that had been left behind during the exile, they were there when all these other people were moved in, and they began to marry. Okay, and a time came where after this exile, after they began to return from the exile, they were told because they were intermarried that they couldn't worship at the temple. Got real angry about it.
Yeah.
Okay, so they decided they were going to build a temple on Mount Gerizim. All right, and that was shut down. Okay, that was after the Babylonians, the Seleucids came through, and the Ptolemies came through, and the Greeks came through, and finally the Romans, and they would never they never had a chance to build a temple until finally we get to Jesus with the woman at the well, right? And she's a Samaritan, and part of their conversation was, she says, "Oh, you Jews, you believe you can only worship." This is going on 300 years later. You only believe that that you can only worship Yahweh at the temple in Jerusalem, but we worship Him here on Mount Gerizim. So this was still going on. This fierce division that had occurred and really began right here in a real sense. And of course, Jesus comes back and says, "Hey, where you worship doesn't matter. It's how you worship, spirit and in truth." See, and that's what Ezra was missing here. It wasn't all these other things. It was how. What is this? What does this mean? How are you exercising this in your life? Okay, and there was not enough of the spirit and truth part. Okay, but
Ezra was trying to. He was concerned about the lineage. You know what I'm saying? And that's what this is. I think is he's trying to use the law to preserve the lineage.
To the genealogy and the geography. That was the two most important things. And that's an important part of what God is doing.
But he forgot real quick that God told Abraham that his descendants should go on and on.
Exactly.
So he was trying to use that, but he wasn't even believing what God had said from the beginning because he thought it would stop right there. So I mean,
well, he didn't look at that as law. Like I say, he was all about the law.
Yeah,
it was Leviticus and Deuteronomy.
Right.
And when you begin to read those books,
he broke up families. I mean, he sent people out.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Most
Well,
definitely.
what was missing is what Jesus brought, which was compassion.
yeah.
Uh-huh.
They didn't have compassion.
Yeah.
The
Right.
law was more important than compassion for the people.
Right. And they owned grace. Three or four times in this passage it mentions God's grace. And they felt like that was an exclusive thing for them. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I know that people to this day, they use the Old Testament where it says, "Do not marry out of your tribe," concerning that people marrying other races.
Right.
They think,
That's exactly.
that we're doing wrong, But we're all God's children.
That's right.
And in that, what they were discussing really had as much to do with land
Mm-hmm.
acquisition than it did anything. Yeah, it gets. You have to pay attention.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and it does make Ezra bad.
It doesn't make him bad.
He's
but
limited.
He's closed-minded.
Yeah.
I mean, he looks like a closed-minded,
Mm-hmm.
woe is me type
Like what's going on
guy,
now.
Yeah.
Even though I'm sure he felt like, I don't know, you gotta have a little bit of sorry for him, trying to make it all right, trying to do what he
Well-
did.
He took a lot on his shoulders. I mean, he was
Yeah,
trying to
but
fix
still,
everything
he
that was
forgot
Yeah.
about the people.
And you got to remember too. This is 4 months in, basically, 4 to 5 months in, maybe 6. Hadn't been there long, and this is not what you want to deal with when you've come back to rebuild the temple and provide a people. God calls His people out to Himself to do this, and it's all getting muddied, and He's got to do something to fix it.
And where does it say God told Ezra?
Well, it doesn't.
It doesn't.
I know, that's what I'm saying. So Ezra.
But am I supposed to? I'm not supposed to preface every sermon I preach with "God told Mark."
I know, but you're not telling them to go.
No, I'm not.
separate the
You're right.
families either. Yeah.
All right. So he says, separate them. So he says, we'll do what you say, but there are many people, and it is the rainy season. So there's a practicality comes to this. We can't just go out and start doing this. This is a tough time of the year. We don't have the stamina to stay out in the open. So yeah, it's a rainy season. It would be like sending us out during a snow season somewhere, and you got to get this done. And so they're asking for more time. This isn't something that can be done in a day or two, for we have rebelled terribly in this matter. So what they're saying is, there's a lot of folks out there that have intermarried, and it's going to take a little while to get this done. And this is the worst time of the year, weather-wise, to be moving around the country to do this. Let our leaders represent the entire assembly. Then let all those in our towns who have married foreign women come at appointed times together with the elders and judges of each town in order to avert the fierce anger of our God concerning this matter. There's that flaring of the nostrils again. All right, so they go out and say that let us be representatives of all the people. Now, obviously, not all the people were there, okay, or else this wouldn't have been a problem. So, what was the edict? If you didn't show up, you lost your land. So you would begin to think, okay, these people didn't show up, or they could be told right now, so they're fixing to lose their family and their land. That's the picture behind this that we have to remember too. Which, who gives the land?
God.
Is God taking away the land?
No.
So here we got a problem.
Yeah.
See, it's one of those hidden problems that are not called out, but is a real situation.
It's threatening. It's like so God can
Yeah.
turn away.
Yeah.
Until God turns away, but God doesn't turn away.
So this is not a perfect scenario by any means. Okay. So they go out and it says that they're gonna come at the appointed time, meaning coming to Jerusalem, and they're going to come with their elders and the judges in each town. There's going to be clear understanding from everybody what's going on, so that somebody can't go back and say, oh no, it happened this way, oh no, it happened that way. The people in their towns that make these decisions and enforce decisions are going to be there personally to know the decision. And all of this is to avert God's fierce anger, which so far God hasn't revealed to anyone that he's going to be angry, but he expressed that he would be angry with the people when they went into Canaan and misbehaved, and they misbehaved, so they're assuming his anger. Only Jonathan, son of
See, that's the thing that gets me, is when you're talking about God being angry and flaring his nostrils, who's saying that? Ezra.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? So, is he the only one that's having communication with God? No, we know he's not having communication.
That's right.
He's using his law to say, hey, God's going to be mad because this is what the law is,
That's right. So so there's some assumptions happening here all the time. Yeah.
Nothing's changed.
So we're thankfully we're given the opportunity to look at this honestly for what it is. Nehemiah doesn't fix the problem either. We find a greater degree of what's happening, really, and then things kind of just wait for Jesus to show up.
Yeah, it's like, oh well, Lord, I tried.
It really is. Yeah.
Don't blame me. I tried to.
And
But like Pastor said, God didn't ask him to do that. He took
No.
it upon himself. And so I guess like today, I'm living proof. You step ahead of God, there's consequences.
Yeah.
What you think up here does not happen in reality.
And really, y'all, the beautiful part of this whole story is that Esther is sandwiched right in between them.
Mm-hmm.
So when you read all three together, we probably should have put Esther in its place and then come back to some of this, because what we discover there is that you've kind of got all this misunderstanding that's going on and activity, and then right in the middle you've got Esther and that whole thing with Haman and Mordecai and all of that going on. And not a word, not a peep out of God. His name's not even mentioned in the book. But when you get to the end, it's like you're climbing this mountain and you look back over the landscape and you can see everything and you see him and all of it. Yeah. And then you go back to this, and it's kind of like that's the high point in the whole story. It really is remarkable then to look at the whole thing together and see that It doesn't take a lot to wind up in God's will when we are just listening and paying attention, and not having to find all the answers on your own.
Is that the only book in the Bible where he's not mentioned?
Where his name, his name is not mentioned. Yeah. It's the only one I know of.
Yeah.
So they're going to do what they says. It says, so Jonathan, there's 4 that they oppose this. Okay, they don't like the idea of doing this. All right. So what do they oppose? There's 3 things going on. Do they oppose the idea of the marriages being broke up? That's one possibility. Do they oppose the way that they're going to do this, where they go and the timing and all that, or do they not want to wait? They don't want to wait at all. That's the 3 possibilities. Which the last one's less likely. That's not a big thing. The waiting is not a big deal. Having this process of going to the towns and letting the leaders do it, I don't see why that would be a big deal. I think their objection is to the whole thing.
Yeah.
They're seeing something there where this is not a good thing.
Yeah. I mean, they didn't want to give up their families.
Yeah. And so we find in that when we look at these names, one of them's from a line of priest, and then one of them is mentioned as a Levite. Yeah. So from their family position and their position of authority, they're kind of as equals to Ezra in this. The exiles did what had been proposed. The priest Ezra selected men who were the family heads, all identified by name, to represent their ancestral families. They convened on the first day of the 10th month to investigate the matter. So this is the 10th month. And by the first day of the first month, they had dealt with all the men who had married foreign wives. So it took 2 months to get all these men gathered up. Yeah. So these are the ones who were found to have foreign women from the descendants of the priest. And so they name them, and the priest actually offered a ram from a flock for their guilt. And then it names the rest of them, and there's no mention of any other sacrifice. But if you look, a good many, so you have these priests that are mentioned up here. Well, you can't see what I'm pointing to. This first paragraph, the first paragraph there, and then below that are more priests. All of that group is priests. Then the Levites, then the singer, turns out to be one, the gatekeepers, and then these were people that had just come back as a part of the exile. All of that list. All right. 111 men in all. It says all of these had married foreign women, and some of the wives had given birth to children. And then guess what? That's the end. Okay. Then we go into Nehemiah. There's 2 chapters in Nehemiah that probably follow this one, which we'll look at next time. Because I can get into all of that, but there's every indication that they were written together, and then they got separated, and then when they were brought back as separate books, part of it got put into another one. And this is very common in the Old Testament that this happened. The Chronicles are the same way. We talked about that a little bit, how when you start matching up times and numbers and names, it's out of order in some places. It doesn't change the truth of it. It just makes it harder to read. It's kind of like me reading Tolkien or somebody. I just can't do it. I can't learn all that old English stuff that he writes in there. So that's kind of how it's left. And of course, we finished the rest of it with Nehemiah. And when we get into Nehemiah, we find that it's the same theme, that there's a need for holiness and there's a need for worship. And there's opposition to that is going on. And we find different ways that is dealt with. because of different people that God provides to do this. The end result is going to be that God is going to be worshipped by his people. And what that makeup is of people and where their heart's in that is yet to be determined. Okay? So God's got a lot of work to do in the hearts of his people to get this moving in the right direction. So often when we look at the prophets, we rely so heavily on the prophets to know what happens during these, right before the exile and during the exilic period and even coming home. But then those prophets that are speaking to that period, we don't spend a lot of time looking at those guys because they're pretty harsh. And a lot of what they have to say we feel like we can't relate to. So I mentioned before, when we get through with this little bit of history, we're going to do Esther, which I won't do justice because we're going to kind of move through and hit the high points. It's so rich. We can be here a long time. Yeah. So we'll hit the high points on Esther, and then we'll go back. So we'll have the whole lay of the land historically, and then we'll go back and start looking at the prophets chronologically, okay, and the way that they appear in history, and then those that overlap. I'll do my very best to deal with the subject matter upon which they overlap, so that you get they don't deal with the same situations the same. When we look at the whole work of the prophets, we get the full depth and breadth of what God's trying to say. And it's really a good idea to look at them together like that. So I'm going to try to do that in a way that's comprehensible. But books like Obadiah, I think that's the first one. We'll jet right through him because he's an angry dude. And it's hard to relate. It's hard to relate. Oh yeah, he's angry. He's angry. Habakkuk's angry. They're all angry at that point because they're seeing things fall apart, and they want to do something about it. And God has told them what to say. And then there's other events that are happening that seem like natural events, like locust swarms and that kind of thing. That God is using these guys to point out and say, no, it's not. This isn't normal, and I've sent this for a reason. You better listen. So that has a lot of application to us today, but only as we have to really be careful to relate that historically to what they were saying to their people, but also to the church today. There's a lot of lessons about that, and even to our culture and society today. Because doesn't it feel like we're in a swarm of locusts right now? Geopolitically, it just, every time you turn around, there's something else happening.
Shaking my head off.
They're now at my work. If you haven't been vaccinated, they started out with like $40 or something. Like when it started, they'll pay you $150 to